Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, according to the time zone where you are. My name is Rajiv Varshney. I'm a research program director for Global Program Accelerated Crop Improvement with the International Crop Research Institute for the Semi-Arid Tropics, that is ICRISAT. It's an international CGIAR research institute. I'm also an adjunct professor with Murdoch University in Australia. In our research, we have been generating huge amount of sequencing data from plant genetic resources and also using them in the crop improvement. So I have a keen interest in digital sequence information, DSI. In this session, I'm participating and will be presenting my views in personal capacity and not essentially of the organizations or the country to which I belong. So first of all, I would like to welcome you all for this Asia and Pacific webinar of DSI's Scientific Network, a multilateral solution to the DSI dilemma. As we know, the term digital sequence information, DSI, currently has no agreed definition. The term DSI was first introduced into discussions under the Convention of Biological Diversity, CBD, and its Nagoya protocol on access to genetic resources and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from their utilization. The Nagoya Protocol on ABS was adopted in 2010 in Nagoya, in Japan, and entered into the force in October 2014. Since then, DSI has become a placeholder. Although its concept and scopes are not clear, there are various other terms that might be used in practice, including genetic sequence data, genetic sequence information, dematerialized genetic resources, in silico utilization, etc. In recent years, DSI has become a hot topic of discussion. Several debates are going on around the world, such as if DSI is out of scope of the CBD and the Nagoya protocol, or DSI is within the scope and can be addressed purely in mutually agreed terms, or DSI is within scope, but additional measures are required, such as adapting existing systems for tracing and monitoring, sui generis systems, for instance, open source or common licenses, or cryptographic measures for tracking and securing benefits such as blockchain. Or most importantly, multilateral approaches to the benefit sharing involving DSI. So in this webinar, we would like to discuss perspectives of researchers and users on DSI and their needs and priorities regarding ABS system for DSI, with a focus on the need for a multilateral system as the best way to achieve a win-win outcome balance, open access and benefit sharing. We believe that this webinar is expected to provide more policymakers and other scientists with an understanding of the importance of this issue to researcher and the tangible impacts a CBD decision can have on how research should take place. We are very much excited to share that we have a participation of large number of scientists or policymakers from many countries in this webinar. Now, in terms of the structure, in this webinar, we will have first brief overview of the DSI users, and then we will have two mini panel discussions. The first one will deal with the DSI user experience, and the second one will deal with the benefit sharing mechanism for DSI. We will also take some questions from the participants during the session, and of course, at the end of the session. So at this stage, I would like to request our host team to provide logistics. May I request Isabel Coxe to share some views and to offer the logistic in this webinar. Isabel, please.
Thank you very much, Rajiv. I'm going to just share some slides for some essential housekeeping matters. It's very straightforward. So this is a webinar. I think by now many of you will be familiar with this format. Just so that you all know, this webinar is being recorded. The video may be posted in the future on the website of the DSI Scientific Network. So just for awareness, if you're uncomfortable being part of a webinar that is being recorded, it is of course possible for you to leave. We will not be sharing the information of who attended the webinar, but just the content and the discussions that took place. Key thing I just want to cover quickly here is how we ask questions to panelists. As attendees, you cannot speak up. So if you want to ask a question to the panelist, at the bottom of your screen, you have a little icon that says Q&A. It's circled in red here. This is a Q&A box. You should feel free to put in questions for the panelists to answer in that box. We ask you not to use the chat box, which is slightly further down towards the left. It's a lot less easy for us to manage. The Q&A box is very nicely organized. It's easier for us to track what questions have been asked, which ones have been answered. So please do so. Feel free to ask questions at any time. Just write them, if possible in English, in the Q&A box, and we will try to take some of those and put them to the panelists, time allowing. Just some ground rules for how we ask you to participate. So Q&A box for questions, not for statements, not for discussions between you participants. There is a chat if you want to have an ongoing side conversation, that's perfectly fine. But the Q&A box for questions, please. Some of the questions might be able to be answered in writing by the panelists during the session, and you will see them move to the section answered questions. But given the time, we might have to answer most of them, or as many as we can verbally, and we will mark them as answered verbally when they are. So you should be able to see how things progress. In keeping with usual ground rules for online forums, we ask you not to write anything that has a foul or what we call offensive language, anything that would have a slur, insults, or swear words. This is not a forum for personal attacks or comments targeting individuals. And of course, not for discussions that have nothing to do with DSI and ABS. So we will be dismissing questions that don't follow those guidelines. I'm sure most of you understand that it is very important that we keep an environment that is friendly and respectful to all participants and all panelists, and that it won't be an issue in this session. And of course, you have the option to ask questions anonymously. So if that's what you'd like to do, you can choose that, or you can ask them and your name will be seen. But the most important thing is your question, not so much your name. So do not worry, we will just ask the question. If you want to refer it to a particular panelist, you can also indicate that in the question. And I think that is all for now in terms of logistics, since there's no interpretation for this webinar, it's only in English, so that should keep it fairly straightforward. I hope you enjoyed this very much. Thank you, Rajiv, and I'm going to give you back the screen.
Thank you very much, Isabel, for this information. I'm sure that we will have good questions and suggestions from our participants. So now let's start our webinar, and I think we will have a presentation from Dr. Amber Scholz on DSI users and contributors. And I think that this presentation is going to show that how DSI is used. Let me briefly introduce Amber. Dr. Amber Scholz is the deputy to the director at the Leibniz Institute, DSMZ, the German collection for microorganisms and cell cultures in Germany. She has broad experience in science and policy through her work in the United States at the White House, Office of Science and Technology Policy as Executive Director to the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, from the National Cancer Institute as a policy advisor, and as a science fellow to the California State Senate Environmental Quality Committee. May I invite Amber, please, to share your presentation. Amber, you are mute. Can you please unmute yourself?
You would think I would get smoother after all these months. Thank you, Rajiv, for the kind introduction. Good afternoon, good evening, or perhaps even good morning to each of you. I'd like to just give you a brief overview of what Rajiv mentioned, using and also, of course, introducing for the first time in public, the DSI Scientific Network. So the network itself was founded in November 2020. It has 36 members currently from 16 countries and all continents except Antarctica. Members of the network are DSI providers, users, and researchers. Our mission is to contribute to policymakers and other stakeholders' understanding of DSI in the most broad context. And our goal is that we recognize that finding a solution that balances open access with benefit sharing, including monetary benefits, will be essential to deliver a global biodiversity framework that meets the priorities of different stakeholders and contributes to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So the first recognition that we have amongst our membership is that we understand why there is now a call for benefit sharing from DSI. And there's really two reasons for this. Number one, that since the Nagoya Protocol was negotiated in 2010, there has been an enormous and indeed exponential growth of DNA sequence data in the global databases. Number two, in parallel to this sequence data growth, there have been an incredible amount of new tools to work with data in silico. So this is really known broadly under the context of synthetic biology, and in particular, key breakthroughs like the CRISPR-Cas9 genome editing or the genetic scissors approach, a Nobel Prize last year, enable biologists or scientists in general to be able to do things with sequence data that they couldn't do a decade or more ago. And so if you look at this chart here on the left, you can see not all of these tools listed on the left have 3 stars. That means we still need, and we always will likely, need physical access to genetic resources, but the demand has fundamentally changed. However, the data ecosystem for DSI is not like the Nagoya Protocol. So there are 263 million sequences in the databases from every country in the world. The entire DSI data set, all 263 million, are downloaded 34 million times a year. There are about 10 to 15 million users in every country in the world. And this data is then promulgated via 2,000 downstream databases that themselves also have hundreds of thousands or millions of users. There are about 500,000 current publications and patent applications. And perhaps most importantly, this ecosystem is very different from looking at an organism, like let's say a lion, right? Where I look at it and I can say, that's a lion. And I look at a sequence and I don't know what it means, right? I look at these letters TGACT and I don't know what they mean. And the only way that I can know what they mean is to compare them to everything else that's known about these 4 letters. And that's a fundamentally different thing than the Nagoya Protocol. So to give you a better sense of usage, I'd like to take you through a subset of the DSI world. So 9 million sequences that have been cited in 118,000 open access publications. So what we did here was to take the scientific literature and ask who is providing and using DSI. So here's an example of a random publication, a new virus. And we asked who are the authors. So we take the first author, Christopher Cruz, and we ask where is his physical location. It was in Peru. Then we look with text mining, with massive high throughput text mining, for the unique identifiers that identify sequence data in a scientific publication. So here's an example, AF307324. And then we ask and look up in the DSI data set in the database, which country did that sequence come from? Where was it sampled? And that was, oh, I'm sorry, the box shifted, but that in this case was Brazil. And so what this would look like is that the providing country would be Brazil. That's where the sequence data was generated from, where the genetic resource actually came from. And the using country would then be Peru. That's the location of the author. And when we look at that across these 8 million sequences and these 118,000 publications, we can look at new trends. And now I'd like to show you some of the countries where our panelists today that we'll hear from, what their patterns of use in providing. So today we have Dr. Suzuki, who will be on our panel. And so here's the data for Japan. There are 117 countries in the world that use data from Japan, where Japan is the provider country for these countries. So you can see countries like the United Kingdom over here, but you can also see so-called provider countries like Cameroon using Japanese DSI in a publication. You can see Japanese scientists are using DSI from 149 countries. So they're using data from, for example, Italy and New Zealand, and they're also using it from Vietnam and from Fiji. 94 countries are using Indian DSI. So again, we'll hear from Yogesh Shouche today on the panel, and you can see again, there's United Kingdom using Indian DSI. You can also see neighboring countries like Malaysia, or much farther away countries like Tanzania or Barbados here, right? And again, although India would perhaps traditionally identify itself as a provider country, actually they use data from more countries than they provide to. So Indian scientists are using DSI from 150 countries. Again, here, using data from Italy, from Pakistan, from Mali, from Sudan, and many other countries. 57 countries are using Philippine DSI. So Eiza, you will be on the panel today, and you can see again here that Philippine DSI is also used widely around the world, but at a slightly different scale. Philippines, of course, is a much smaller country than India, for example. And perhaps here, somewhat more aligned with the typical provider-user relationship, there are fewer countries that Philippine scientists are using DSI from. Although again, this is still 32 countries that Philippine scientists like Eiza are using DSI from. So using DSI from Switzerland, but also from Indonesia, from China, and from many other countries in the world. If you take these data and you look at them in very, very simple buckets. So the OECD, for example, here is high-income countries. The G77 are low-income countries, and BRICS are the middle-income countries, such as Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And you can start to find out interesting patterns, such as, if we look here on the x-axis, the countries of origin, where the physical genetic resource came from, and then where the users are located, broken down through the individual pieces of that graph, you can see that in each bar, the biggest user of that regions or that group, that economic blocks DSI, is that same one. So not being quite clear here. OECD users are the biggest proportion of users of OECD sourced DSI. G77 is the biggest chunk in the G77 column. G77 users are the biggest users of G77 sourced DSI. And BRICS users are the biggest amount of users for BRICS DSI. This is the idea that DSI is actually used more by locals, regional users, than by foreigners. Another important thing that we learned from this graph is that OECD DSI, because there's so much of it in the database, is actually used 3 times more than BRICS or G77 DSI. So that's the difference here between the height of this bar relative to these other two. And actually, I think in the global biodiversity framework that's being negotiated in parallel to the DSI debate, we want to fill in the amount of DSI from these countries to give them a level playing field to enable those scientists in those countries to be able to do more with their biodiversity. And an important note here too is if you add up the number of publications going across, so the same color in each bar going across, you will see that there are about 40% fewer DSI-based publications from BRICS and G77 authors. And I would argue for sustainable development, this ability to have scientific output is exactly what we within the network want to increase. So what are the implications of all of this? Our current thinking and our discussions within the network, and what we would like to talk about, I think, in the panel and in the broader context, is a decoupled multilateral framework for benefit sharing and DSI. So this might perhaps at first glance be a kind of a confusing graph of different arrows and flows, but there's 4 major points that we would like to sort of bring home. Number 1 is that access to DSI should be decoupled from benefit sharing. That is to say, the benefit sharing, the monetary benefit sharing, does not need to be coupled to access to the data, access to the database. Otherwise, you will create disincentives to use that data, either a bilateral system that will say it competes with DSI that doesn't have conditions on it, or you create the inability for scientists in low and middle income countries to use this data if you put up paywalls here. Number two, there's an opportunity here. Remember those green question marks, yeah, on the previous slide, the ability to generate more DSI from BRICS and from low-income countries, to incentivize national contributions of DSI and to recognize the contribution of DSI to these global databases. So you can use the geographical information, like I just showed you in these network diagrams, to give from the multilateral benefit fund a bonus payment, for example, for the data that has been generated new in that year to the database. The core focus of this graph is really to say we need to enable sustainable use and bioeconomic innovation directly relating to the global biodiversity framework goals. And finally, if capacity building around this new benefit sharing mechanism has a decoupled mechanism, it is also an opportunity to have more funding invested in scientific capacity building for the exploitation of this DSI, rather than to create a whole new set of DSI regulatory frameworks around the world. And with that, I would like to thank again Rajiv for the kind introduction, and I look forward to discussing with my fellow panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amber, for an excellent presentation. You have very elegantly presented on DSI, how they are being generated and used around the world. I think your presentation clearly shows that how many countries are being benefited from DSI when this is in open access, and you rightly pointed out or emphasized on decoupling of multilateral framework for benefit sharing and DSI. Thank you very much, Amber. I could see some questions are already coming, but I think we will take some of these questions later as we discuss DSI user experience in the next panel. So with this background information for this webinar, we move to now to that mini panel session number 1. And here we will be discussing about the DSI users experience. Friends, we have got a great panel with outstanding researchers and policymakers from Asia and Pacific. And in addition to Amber, you heard her just now, we have other panelists, very eminent scientists, and these include Dr. Yogesh Shouche, with over 28 years of research experience in the field of microbial ecology, microbial molecular taxonomy, and biodiversity. Yogesh is leading the National Center for Microbial Resources, NCMR, in India. Next, we have Professor Mutsuaki Suzuki, who is the Director of NIG Innovation and Intellectual Property Unit at National Institute of Genetics in Japan. Mutsuaki is also a member of the Consulting Committee for ABS Guidelines in Japan and a special member of Nagoya Protocol Committee in the Science Council of Japan, and also a founder of the Access Benefit Sharing Support Team for Academia. Then we have Professor Charles Lawson from the Griffith Law School, Griffith University. Before joining the university sector, Charles worked as a lawyer in both the private and public sectors, including at the Australian Government Solicitor and the Australian Department of Finance and Deregulation. His research focus is on biology law and public administration law. Finally, we have Professor Eizadora from the Marine Science Institute, University of Philippines, Dilman. Eiza is an associate dean at the College of Science and a member of the Department of Science and Technology Biosafety Committee in Philippines. We are very much excited to have you all. So I would like to welcome all the panelists for this session. Now let's start our session. And as I mentioned, so like I understand that now all of us are having really good background about DSI, especially when Amber has made this presentation. So let's discuss the first point about the use of DSI from the researcher's perspective. Maybe I would like to ask first Yogesh. So Yogesh, based on your experience, how do you use DSI and what matters to you as a user?
Thanks, Rajiv, for a nice introduction. And this question. We have been using DSI for last several years for many purposes. Our work being related to microbial taxonomy and microbiome, we primarily use DSI for sequence comparisons. And as you know, for whether it is taxonomy or microbiome work, these are global level comparisons. So we used, depending on the question which we are asking, we use data from almost every country in the world for comparison purpose. And what matters the most here is the free access to the data with all the relevant metadata is what is important for us. So the data should be easily accessible with all the relevant metadata. And as I said, primarily our research questions are global level comparisons of the microbiome or genomic sequences. So easy accessibility is another important criteria that which we look for. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yogesh, for highlighting this thing. I think that you are representing that majority of the researchers. I am also one of them. So thank you very much, Yogesh. So now if I can ask the similar question to Eiza. Eiza, what do you say about this, and how do you use DSI and what matters to you as a user?
Yeah, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. So similar to Dr. Shouche, we use DSI to actually identify, do molecular identification of the microbial symbionts for my research. We look for microbial symbionts from marine organisms. On top of that, we also use the genetic sequences for protein identification. So we do proteomics, mass spectrometry-based proteomics. And so having open access to data, doing the comparative analysis, as well as, for example, if there's no genome available, but there's a genome of a, related organism, that would help us greatly. So yeah, so similar to Dr. Shouche, open access is really key to our basic research, to what we do here in the Philippines. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eiza, for very clearly presenting your views and your perspective. So now let's move to the next question. And maybe I can ask this question to Amber. And as we know that a huge amount of DSI data is being generated, and every day this is being accumulated more and more. So for you, Amber, what makes it possible to gather and manage such amount of data?
It's hard. I mean, and this is the old saying, you don't want to reinvent the wheel. And I think this has been true in many different institutes that I've worked on or in different partners. What's really helpful is to have a central infrastructure. And that's the really exciting thing about the core infrastructure that we have, is the International Nucleotide Sequence Database Collaboration, which is 3 different distributed databases, one in the United States, one in the UK on behalf of the European Union, and one in Japan, located actually at Dr. Suzuki's institute. And the ability for me as a researcher to upload my sequences to this databases and then to not have to take care of them anymore. Yeah, I list those numbers in my publications, but then they're there and they are preserved for all eternity for other researchers to be able to use and to verify that what I said I did in my publication is true. Otherwise, what I would have to do and what Eiza would have to do and what Mutsuaki would have to do and what you would have to do is we would have to all host our little servers and continuously pay for this data to be available in order for us to be able to do our work. And that would just be an incredible, obviously, waste of resources. But by creating one central library, we all get to share, we get to verify that what we said we did is correct, and we get to build and stand on the shoulders of giants, as Albert Einstein once said.
Thank you, Amber. I think very nicely said. So maybe I ask the same questions to Mutsuaki. So Mutsuaki, Amber told this is very difficult and hard. What about you? Because you have been associated very closely with the DSI in those discussions. What is your view on this aspect, Mutsuaki?
Oh, thank you. First, let me use the term DSI today to mean nucleotide sequence data, NSD, in ICRISAT. ICRISAT is a consortium of the public database where the DNA and RNA sequence data registered by researcher and stored, managed, and made available free of charge to people all over the world. 3 institutions synchronize and make the same data available. When researchers submit a manuscript to journal, they need an accession number from ICRISAT, and it is a public database and can be used without any financial burden from the users. The researcher community around the world has recognized the essential for it. This is because it is necessary for all current genetic research and biological research. The operation of the database is funded by the public funds from each country. I think that the DSI is a very important tool so that people all over the world can use it for free. I think this is a great non-monetary benefit sharing. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mutsuaki. I think very nicely said. So we are really having good discussions. And I don't want to make this discussion just monotonous. Let's see that if we have some questions from our participants. There are many questions, and some questions our panelists will be answering live, but some question we may take. I think we would like to take this question, and I would like to request our panelist, anyone can respond, otherwise I may request one particular panelist. So a participant commented, DSI providers and users are interdependent. It is alike sharing many parentages in a pedigree of crop variety in breeding under FAO IT-PGRFA treaty basically. So no one stand alone can live by itself without cooperation of others. So would like to request any panelist who would like to share, answer this question. Maybe
Charles,
Yogesh, sorry, yeah. I was wondering whether Yogesh would like to answer this question.
Yeah, I mean, Rajiv, I agree with him what he has said, that DSI providers are indeed interdependent, and it is very difficult to dissect out who is using what and for what purpose. So I agree with him. I fully agree with him.
Okay, thank you, Yogesh. Second question we may ask maybe Amber. Yeah, she was very keen to answer the first question, so maybe I can ask her to answer this question. How would you fund the system you described for a multilateral system in your presentation? Can you explain further?
Yeah, and I would love it. Maybe also Charles could complement. I know he's researched a lot in this area as well. So I don't think that there is a one-size-fits-all solution for that answer. I think that there are potentially complementary mechanisms that one could consider. You could consider, for example, micro levies on upstream activities, such as DNA sequencing or DNA synthesis, where you might charge, pennies on the dollar for sequencing reagents, for example, and those could get put into multilateral fund. That would kind of cover, your upstream scientific activities. You might also consider at the point of commercialization, when a product comes on the market, that you might have a biodiversity use fee that could be associated, for example. I think the boundaries of that would be really difficult to work out, but the idea is certainly compelling. And there has been a proposal put forth by the African group that is definitely worth, I think, further international discussion and debate for sure. And then there's also sort of taking from the plant model you just asked, that the plant treaty also had made proposals previously on sort of flat fees, on subscription-like fees. Now, it would be really important, you don't want to put a paywall on the databases for reasons that we already covered, but you could imagine that you could sort of set up an international framework and say, this is sort of the flat fee that gives you the right to operate, and it goes into this national fund, and then those let's say, mainly commercial users would get recognition for those contributions. So there's maybe many different ways, and maybe they're even complementary.
Thank you.
I don't know, Charles, if you've also been thinking about this a lot, also from the pathogen space, but also from this sort of decoupled space as well.
Yeah, I think this important question which we need to resolve in the first place is what kind of benefits do we have in mind? So what kind of benefits you have in mind will probably shape a lot the kind of system you have. But I think overriding, and as we're talking about, it's a key theme of the discussion we're having today, has to be both efficient and effective. We've got to make sure that whatever system you have in place doesn't actually undermine access, because access is actually really important. So we've got to find some kind of mechanism which is complementary to access in a way that doesn't actually undermine the basic scientific idea of having access to these materials. And look, I think that could be my main point is let's work out what the problem is first, and then you can start to tailor the kind of solutions. So I think we need to work out what it is people actually want. But we also need to have, as the seminar is making so clear, is we want to also maintain that access, and the access is really important. So balancing access against whatever the mechanism, whatever the problem is, we need to work that out, but access is clearly a critical factor to that.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Charles. Thanks, Amber. Now, following this not similar question, but I think in the same series, maybe I will have one question, maybe request Charles to answer. So Mutsuaki mentioned about the databases. And in this regard, what do researchers need to do to access a database? And do all governments contribute to those public databases? How does it work? Would you like to share some of your perspective, Charles, on that?
Well, I absolutely. Mutsuaki is looking after one of the key parts of the database. So the global mechanism is 3 public databases, which are paid for essentially by the governments of Japan, the European Union, and the United States. And that's a subsidy of making that information, that data accessible to around the world. They do a great job collaborating in exchanging the data. They've got tools and those sorts of things to making that data available. Lots of additional information is also available. So I guess there's a key benefit in having funded by those governments through making that data accessible, which is a benefit we all get. And as Amber's data shows, all countries around the world are actually accessing and benefiting from that access to that data.
Thank you, Charles. Interestingly, I see one more questions related to that one. Although I was talking only for government perspective, we got one question from the participants. In the current open access sequence databases, how much of the data is contributed by public institutions or researchers, and how much by private institutions? Maybe either, I'm not sure, whether Mutsuaki, you would like to answer this question? Some idea about that?
I know both of the public institution and private institution provided the sequence data. Sorry, now I have no exact data. Amber, do you have? Did you analyze?
No, I mean, that's a really hard thing to do at the global level. I mean, I agree with Mutsuaki, it's going to be both, but to get a percentage on that, with not doing it manually, because again, we're talking about millions, or at least the publications, hundreds of thousands, you would need to take the author affiliation information and be able to categorize it. And potentially with maybe artificial intelligence, you could do that, especially because for larger companies, I'm thinking Bayer or BASF or, where there's clearly an easily recognizable name, you might be able to attribute that section of the data to a private entity. But we haven't yet done that in our analyses. And it wouldn't be a technically simple thing to do. I'd have to think a little bit more about how you would do that. Yeah, I see Yogesh had his hand up. I'd be interested to see what your experience is also with the collection.
I just wanted to add a point that in addition to public and private funding, at least for genome and microbiome, there is a lot of sequencing that is done for diagnostic purpose. And that data, don't think is ever available in any of the databases, whether private or public. That data never comes to any public database, you know. So, but that data could be interesting.
Thank you. Thank you, Amber. Thank you, Yogesh. Aiza, do you have any view on this one based on your experience in Philippines?
In terms of access, you know, just like what everybody said, it would be nice to have that open access because it really would inform basic research. With regard to benefit sharing, I do agree that we need to think about access sharing in terms of genetic resources, but I'm not quite sure how it would play out with the digital sequence space, just because there's already existing, like what Amber said. So yeah, I agree with Charles as well. We should first look at what the problem is before we start to look for solutions. Maybe that's a better option.
Good.
Can I add in one important
Yes,
right here?
Yeah.
It's also really important to recognize is that there are a number of private sector databases which take advantage of the public sector databases and then add in their own information. And it's actually very hard to get a handle on exactly what those databases are. And we have no information about their size. So lots of the plant breeders, the private sector plant breeders, lots of the private sector medical institutions have these huge databases, which we, with the DSI, and we don't really know what the content or what the kind of materials that they have, or the kind of data that they store in there. But we certainly know that they take advantage of the public databases. So there's certainly an issue in there about the private sector involvement. So it's a great question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Charles. Thanks everyone for really. Okay, Amber, please. Yeah.
Sorry, Rajiv, we're getting rowdy here, but you can see you've hit on an interesting point. And I saw Desiree's follow-up comment that she said, or I assume it's a she, most private sector don't publish and have data protection through confidentiality agreements. Yeah, I mean, this is certainly, you know, our suspicion as well. I mean, the hard part again is I really like to have data on that, and that's, you know, harder to come by. There are definitely private sector publications, and if they publish, they're required to put their sequence data at that point in the open access databases. But correct, if they aren't going that mechanism, then there's going to be big amounts of private data. And then the question is, can you ever actually figure out how much that is, what it is, and what can be done about that? I mean, one thing for sure that can be done is if an organism or genetic resource under the Nagoya protocol were accessed by that individual, that entity, that private entity, then of course they should have to negotiate any downstream use and benefit sharing with the country of origin, right? So that can already be covered. This idea that there is a loophole in the Nagoya protocol really kicks in once the data are available publicly and the countries lose the ability to have the justifiable benefit sharing, right? So if a company has private data and they put it in their private database and it's under a benefit sharing agreement, well, then that should be under a benefit sharing agreement and what they do. The problem that the country of origin has is once that data lands in a public database, it becomes impossible to get benefit sharing under the current system from that public data. And so it is important to understand this private database space, but it's the demand for benefit sharing really kicks in once you lose the control, quote unquote, of the database. And so that's what this kind of discussion, just to clarify, those are kind of two different cases.
All right, thank you. I know that this is a very interesting discussion, very good topic, but in the interest of time, I think we need to move on now. And thank you once again, all panelists and all that our participants for bringing these really good points. Now, I think we need to move to the next topic for discussions. And this next topic will be that how does the generation, sharing and use of DSI create benefits for others, besides the researchers using the DSI directly? So in this regard, I think we already are having the similar kind of discussion. Maybe we can ask Mutsuaki first and then Charles for sharing their views. Mutsuaki, can you please come in?
Oh, so, yes, sorry. Oh, Sorry, my connection is.
I can hear you, so yeah.
Okay, next session is.
So I was asking the question that what do you think about the generation sharing and use of DSI creating for others?
Yeah, now connection is nice. Yeah, the use of DSI and NSD has led to the development of all recent biological and biotechnological disciplines. The contribution of the DSI and the biotechnology are almost the contribution of DSI and the contribution of biotechnology are almost identical. DSI contribute with people all over the world, namely environment protection, sustainable use, human and animal health, and improvement of life. The benefit to the general public worldwide are enormous. And it would be the detriment of humanity as a whole if any regulations were to be put in place to discourage the use of DSI. This is why the open science and of DSI and the free access of NSD are so important. Thank you.
Thank you, Mutsuaki. Although my question was different, but I'm glad to see that you have answered the question related to NSD from one of the participants. But I think this makes a lot of sense. So maybe I would like to ask Charles. Charles, what do you think about this particular topic? That how does this generation sharing and use of DSI create benefits for others and not only just for researchers who are using DSI directly?
So I think I'd make 2 points here. The first point is that one of the great things about DSI is it's actually led to a structuring of global information. So it's created essentially a basic backbone for how we collect together basic information about biology, and that's been just tremendous. But I guess the more important question here is that because DSI is essentially a basic research tool, it has benefits for lots and lots of places. The problem is because it happens very early in the process, it then becomes very difficult to attribute a particular sequence or a particular DSI to an output. So we're producing lots and lots of new plant varieties, lots and lots of new medicines. There's lots and lots of environmental benefits that are coming from using DSI. But to be actually able to identify the particular instant where DSI has been engaged because it happens so early in the process makes it very, very difficult. But so I guess that's why we're talking about it, is because it's such an important issue in getting research started, getting the products and services into our economies. It then becomes very, very difficult to identify the actual contribution, the actual value. But that's also why it's problematic. So important, but also problematic. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. I think this is, you are right, that important, but still problematic. So now someone else would like to share the views on this particular topic from our panelist.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
I totally agree with what Charles said, and actually it relates to some of the questions that were in the Q&A, because it's a yes and, right? It is the huge variety of public and social good that you can get from DSI, and the network that's hosting the webinar today. We come from the public sector space. And we're working on things, from bioremediation of contaminated soils up to, the rhinoceros that's going extinct and all of the organisms kind of in between. A global cycle, elemental cycling. I mean, there's a lot of really interesting work being done for the public good, for the common good of man, so to speak. However, the network also recognizes that DSI is legitimately used for commercial products. And like Charles said, it can be really early on, it can be in the middle, it can be in a variety of different forms, it can be from millions of things or from 10 things, and everything in between. And this reality, this complexity is why we're saying, there is a legitimate call for benefit sharing. However, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? You don't want to endanger this massive amount of public good because you policymakers, I guess, have decided you want to nip that benefit sharing loophole in the bud. And we're trying to say, look, there's a way to be able to do both, to actually encourage that public good research and to create ways for, you know, commercial benefits to contribute back to biodiversity, right? That we can do both. That's what we're trying, I think, to sort of communicate in different ways.
Yeah. Thank you, Amber. I will ask one more question to you, Amber, and then after that, we will take the questions from the participants. And there is always a bit confusion, or at least when people present or there an articulation about the use of or usage of the genetic resources and use of the DSI in the research. So based on your experience, can you please clarify to this group the difference in the way genetic resources and DSI are used in research?
Yeah, I mean, that was why I put the slide together, was to kind of preempt that question. I mean, the biggest thing is big data, big data, big data, big data, big data. I mean, genetic resources, we can do those also in bulk, you know. I'd be interested to hear Eiza's perspective. Yeah, when you do your marine sampling, you're also talking probably a couple of hundred samples. You know, you might also have maybe up to 500 or 1,000 different isolates that you get. But we're not usually, when we talk about genetic resources, living organisms, it's just not handleable to do thousands or millions, right? But when it comes to data, that you have to do millions, or else you're not really keeping up with the science. And so the scale is just phenomenally different. And importantly, it's growing exponentially. The data set doubles in size every 2 years. That doesn't sound impressive, but if you think about doubling 1 million or doubling several hundred million, that's a lot of growth. And so when you think about benefit sharing mechanisms, you know, locking it up is not going to solve the problem. I don't know, Eiza, what do you think? I mean, you feel, I intuitively feel like they're different.
Yeah, thanks, Amber. So for our work, it really is two different worlds. So you're right, we do actually isolate a lot of microbial organisms from the symbionts, and it's very hard to culture them and take care of them, but that's a very integral part of our research. We have to do that. But once we have the genetic sequence of a particular isolate, that actually sort of also rationalizes the amount of work that we do. Because as a resource-limited country, we cannot sequence everything that we come across with. You know, that's very expensive for us. But if we have access to the sequences, right, knowing what is already available, if they are related and the genomes are there, that would actually simplify our work in a sense, prioritizing what we need to do, especially for a resource-limited but biodiverse-rich country. So yeah, that's my take on that.
Thank you, Eiza. So Yogesh, you also agree with Eiza on this point? What is your view?
Yes, I agree with her.
Okay, good. Thanks. I think that, yeah, so we can have some more question now from that participants. We have 7 minutes. Maybe there is one question and I may like to request Amber to answer. And this question is about that DSI are used in the process of creating new commercial products. Is this taking advantage of the public databases, the problem that needs solving, or is that not practical or desirable?
Yeah, I'd be interested in other panelists. This is definitely not only me. But Charles said we need to define what the problem is. And I think this comes close to defining what the problem is. I think in terms of benefit sharing from the results of the public database, the problem is, number one, if there should have been monetary benefit sharing, if it had been accessed, a physical genetic resource or that biodiversity had been accessed, trying to figure out if monetary benefit sharing should have been done, could have been done, is probably what many countries, especially low and middle income countries, are interested in. However, I would say there's also a second component, which is it is not been done. I mean, our study is maybe one of the first, but it is very hard to tell also what the non-monetary benefit sharing is. Yeah, we talk about it in anecdotes, but it is really hard to quantify. I think that there are ways that we can do that, and maybe the global biodiversity framework is a way to do that. But so also there's this sense, I think, from many provider countries or countries that see themselves as providers, because we know actually all countries are provider countries, that there's good coming out of the databases. Okay, yeah, good for you researchers, but what does my country have to benefit for it? And I think that translating, that the scientists need to be able to say, you, India, you got this better rice strain out of it. You got this malaria medicine out of it, and trying to sort of identify where and how the benefits came back to you. This is not going to be an easy thing that we can do tomorrow, but the non-monetary benefit sharing that comes out of that is not yet quantifiable. And I think if we could do that, we could also turn a page on countries becoming more comfortable that they're getting something out of it.
Thank you, Amber. Charles, what do you think about it?
Well, I don't want to get too philosophical here, but I think there's a problem we also need to solve about exactly what we mean by information. So, I struggle with this idea that molecules can be information. So I think we need to actually be very clear about exactly what we mean when we talk about DNA sequence information. So, if you were to ask a philosopher to talk about what biological information is, they would probably break it up into what's causal information and what's intentional information. And they would say that, essentially the only kind of information you would find in DNA is probably that it's the code for a protein. Now, the important point here is that when you go from your genotype through to your phenotype, there's a whole lot of other influences in there. So to actually claim or say what the contribution of the DNA sequence is to the final phenotype, which is what it is you're using in your commercial product, is really problematic because there are all those other factors in there. So if you're going to propertize or give rights over sequence information, you're essentially capturing all those other kind of benefits in the non-genetic aspects of your phenotype in your benefit sharing. So I guess we need to be very cautious about exactly what it is we think we're trying to capture here. So Eric's question about taking advantage, I think there's an aspect in there we need to work out very carefully, exactly, precisely, as I said before, what is the problem? And it's a complicated problem.
Thank you, Charles. Yeah. Now, one question I think I can ask Aiza. So we were talking about these benefits, and especially in terms of the public databases, public information, because we are having free access to databases, many products, knowledge, and services generated from these data sets. On the other hand, is some of this benefit accrued more to some countries than others in a way that is potentially unfair? What do you think about it, Aiza?
Yeah, for sure. I think the companies or the countries who can benefit most from using the genetic sequences would be, the countries who have the capability to do synthetic biology, manufacturing, etc. But that doesn't mean that we should be left out, from the equation. What I think would be good to have is actually a multilateral, solution to this, in the sense that we should collaborate upfront, right, from the get-go. If we have, for example, if people would want to collaborate with researchers from the Philippines with regard to looking for this, discovering these microorganisms or this, biodiverse, rich sources, it should not just be our participation in terms of sampling, but in terms of real collaboration, in terms of intellectual input, right? So that's my take on it, because by having this collaborative programs, that would also benefit the local scientists in terms of tooling up and actually being able to, use this resources more. So that could be another form of benefit sharing in terms of technology, capacitating the local countries, especially those who are, limited.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Can I make a practical comment, follow up on that? We have this.
Briefly, Amber. Yeah.
Sorry, I'll be very quick. No, this is a really important point. It's very common within funding agencies that they have international calls where they deliberately want to have different countries working together. Yeah, Germany with the Philippines, or Germany with Argentina, or France with Algeria, or whatever it is. But what often happens is, okay, I have enough funding that I can hire a postdoctoral scientist, and then the person that's funded by their local government, yeah, in Algeria, let's say, or in the Philippines, then has only a much smaller amount of money available to them, so they can't actually hire a full-time scientist. They could hire maybe a half of a student, which doesn't make their science work. So if you had a multilateral fund that was able to supplement these types of international collaborations, so that then ISA has more than 10 hours a week from a student, but actually can hire a postdoctoral scientist like I can here in Germany, then our ability to collaborate is massively different. And that's what we're talking about, taking these funds and enabling this scientific collaboration in a way that is not yet been done. I mean, really transformative to harness this power of DSI.
Thank you, Amber, for highlighting this importance of multilateral fund, and really these kind of things will enhance the collaboration further among different countries and researchers. Very nicely articulated. Again, and we see some other questions. So what we will do, that we will follow up on your point, Amber, and several other questions at the end of the session. But now I think for this panel session, mini panel session number 1, we really had the good discussions, more about that, basically about that DSI users perspective, how we need to move on. So this was really good. Now let's move to the mini panel session 2. And from that previous session, where we were discussing about the DSI importance, generation, sharing, etc. But in this session, we will like to discuss what should be the benefit sharing mechanism for DSI, or at least from our perspective, from the group perspective, should be. So basically, we will share some of our views. We will see from our participants what they think about that mechanism of sharing mechanism for the DSI. For this session, again, we have the same group of the panelists, and I'm sure that you have enjoyed the discussion from this group of, from these panelists: Dr. Yogesh Shouche from India, Professor Mutsuaki Suzuki from Japan, Professor Charles Lawson from Australia, Professor Eizadora from Philippines, and of course, Amber Scholz from Germany. I already have introduced all of them in the previous session, so I don't think that there is a need further introduction in this session. But now, coming to this particular session, and let's have really good discussion on this topic. So let me ask maybe Aiza first, and then Yogesh. So what are you concerned about, or what do you hope for an ABS system? So basically, what would like to see in the access benefit sharing system? Aiza would like to share something?
Yeah, I think I've touched up on that in my previous comment. So definitely in terms of DSI, to have sort of a paywall would not be good for basic research. So I think that's been abundantly clear in this panel. But I also would like to push forth this idea of collaboration between institutions in countries, because I think the way forward is to capacitate the technological capacity of a country to be able to harness genetic resource. So for me, what I hope for in terms of access benefit sharing is definitely having more stake in the genetic resources that we have in my country, for example, in the form of having more responsibility in terms of the research that's being done. And so having that, collaboration in the truest sense, having the scientists participate, that would be my hope for the ABS. Because when we capacitate the countries, then the graph that Amber showed earlier, we can definitely increase the utilization, everybody will benefit, etc. So yes, that's my view, Rajiv, thanks.
Oh, thanks, Aiza, very nicely presented. Maybe we can ask Yogesh, what do you think from your perspective or from the country perspective, that what we should have? What do you hope in the ABS system? Yogesh, please.
Yes, Rajiv, this ABS from DSI has become very complex issue, and a lot of discussion needs to go through into it. And I can give example from the kind of research which I do in the metagenomics data. See, the perceived fear is that we do a metagenomics, let us say, of a marine ecosystem, and marine metagenomics data is there. And tomorrow, from that marine metagenomic sequence data, somebody finds out some compound or some pathway which is extremely valuable, and then gets some benefits out of it in terms of generating some commercial product of high value, some pathway or something. Or, I mean, that can be used in many ways, but this is just one example. And then the perceived fear is that then how does the country of origin gets benefit sharing out of such thing, because the sequence has been originated from India in this case. Sequence also has been done by Indian researcher, but may not be now. Maybe 5 years later, somebody else looks at the sequence data and mines out an important metabolic pathway. So how does one go about benefit sharing in such situation? And that is the perceived fear which probably lawmakers in the country have. And there has to be some mechanism found out through these discussions which would satisfy such perceived fear. I mean, I just got an example of one, but there could be many more such. But on the other hand, if you just give me 1 minute, I also want to highlight another aspect of this, which is what I argue nowadays always, that the biggest example of international sharing of the sequence information today we see in terms of coronavirus genome sequences. The kind of information that has come up would not have been possible without quick information sharing at the global level. So this is what I would like to add. Thanks.
Thank you, Yogesh. You know, you very nicely gave this example of coronavirus. If we wouldn't have these open access genome sequence, etc., I doubt that we would have so much faster development of vaccine, and which eventually
vaccines, diagnostic tests would not have been possible without real-time sequence information exchange. Yes.
So many times we do not pay attention on all these topics, but anyway. So I think, again, very good discussions, and I know I'm concerned about time as well, but we will have some of these follow-up questions and that answering to the questions from participants later stage. So maybe the next question is, and Yogesh, we can ask you about that one. So we are talking about Nagoya protocol. So what can be learned from the experience of Nagoya?
See, I feel we have gone overboard on implementation of Nagoya protocol and ABS. And again, I give you the best example for which we are suffering for almost a decade or so. That then again this, the implementation of Nagoya protocol for microorganisms. So we are not yet clear as to how exactly Nagoya protocol ABS sharing mechanism should be applicable to microorganisms. And since there is both the extremes in this case, especially for India, the deposition of cultures from for taxonomic purpose is the issue which is lying undecided for a decade or so. So, the same thing should not happen to DSI. My fear is that the fate which microbial cultures are seeing today, the same fate should not happen to DSI by overzealousness of ABS under Nagoya protocol. That is my major concern.
Thank you, Yogesh. And this is not only for microbial culture, although I work for the international system of the CGIAR, but I am aware that similar kind of issues we had in the plant genetic resources as well. And after this SMTA or all these things, so sometimes this is restricting the research of sharing the germplasm, etc. So I think, as you said, that we don't want to see the similar situation from the DSI, which can impede the research activities across the continent, across the countries. Thank you. And I know that many scientists, they share the similar kind of experience. What do you think about this thing, Mutsuaki? Because you have been associated with Nagoya protocol as well. What is your experience? And yeah.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, I like Nagoya protocol because I was there when COP10 was adopted in Nagoya. Now I am in contact with the Nagoya protocol officials from different countries because I'm a founder of the ABS support team. And I feel that they are very passionate about the Nagoya protocol. And in some countries, the law and rules are much more developed. On the other hand, there are some countries that are still in the process of developing them. And it is still difficult to get PIC. Yeah, it is hoped that PIC will soon be facilitated in all countries. I would also like to know more about the yeah, I hope researcher in each country, I hope know the Nagoya protocol, yeah, in providing country. And we would also like to support the development of the capacity building for the DSI in each country where is not yet fully available. And I believe that the scientific community need to be more involved in discussion with DSI. Thank you.
Thank you. I think this is thank you very much, Mutsuaki, that, and you mentioned that we should have the feedback or consultation from scientists. I think this is one of those kind of event from that DSI Scientific Network, which is creating awareness and bringing that inputs from scientists. So I think this is really good. Now, I think we can take some question, maybe one question, and maybe we'll ask Charles to answer this question and related to those points which we were discussing in this first part of this mini panel session 2. And I'm going to Charles because he has been a lawyer and he knows all these things very nicely. So if commercial companies are able to access DSI publicly available, when without it, they would otherwise have had to access the actual genetic resources, wouldn't that take away the benefit sharing from the communities of providers, such as the indigenous people?
Yeah, I think that's the nub of the political problem we were talking about with DSI. Is this idea is that it's circumventing the traditional access and benefit sharing scheme. But I guess what I'd say to that, and the response I give there is that, and you know, coronavirus is the classic example.
Mm-hmm.
The virus comes from it originated in a country somewhere. That country then could assert, you know, access and benefit sharing. You know, the country that it probably came from is not asserting access and benefit sharing obligations, but you know, they could put a price if they had asserted their access and benefit sharing. They could have put a price on every vaccine that was being delivered. Now the question is that the best way to deal with this particular problem? In the case of coronavirus, it probably would have delayed by a long time us getting a vaccine. But that doesn't get away from the idea of trying to bring some justice into the system. So yes, I think the question is spot on, is that clearly if you can access information or data about the product without actually having to engage in the benefit sharing, that's undermining the justice of the benefit sharing scheme. We've got a problem, we need to work out how to deal with it. So I think absolutely there's a problem. The question is, what's the best way to go about dealing with this? Now it's talking about indigenous peoples here, or First Nations peoples. We've got a problem here too, which is an issue about, you know, our United Nations system is set up in recognition of nation states. It's the nation states who are organizing, addressing, and working out the access and benefit sharing. It's not the individuals in the states, and it's also not the peoples who are wanting to self-determine in those nation states. So how we're going to resolve and how we're going to be able to deliver kind of justice to not only the countries of origin, but also the various groupings in those countries of origins. This is an ongoing, incredibly complicated problem.
Thank you, Charles. Yeah, thank you very much. And I think now related to the benefit sharing, we will be asking next one or two questions. maybe this time I will put this question to you, Amber and Charles. And this question is, when we think about benefits accruing from DSI use, what share do we see as monetary versus non-monetary? Because many times when we talk about benefit sharing, majority of time we think about only monetary, but I think there's a lot of implication, positive thing from the non-monetary benefit sharing as well. So what do you think, Amber, about this particular topic?
Man, Rajiv, you have all sorts of hard questions. I mean, the problem is we don't have the data, right? The problem is that we have only assertions on both sides in terms of what the monetary benefit sharing should be, although there's no set measure for what should is even, let alone what could. And the same thing for non-monetary benefit sharing. I mean, that's one of the reasons that together with colleagues at IPK and Gottesleben and at EBI, Guy Cochran, Jens Freitag, and Matthias Lang, we've been trying to quantify, these use and providing patterns to try and wrap our heads around, like, how big is the space? And then also the next step for this research is to A, mine the patent literature for exactly this kind of information, and B, to also try to figure out what this research costs and what kinds of sectors it's being done in. Is it mostly in health? Is it mostly in conservation? Is it mostly in natural product research? These are kinds of things that you can do with a global data set. And the crazy thing is, in comparison to the Nagoya protocol, there is, in that space, in genetic resources, there is no central database, right? There is no catalog of who has what where and what gets taken by others and moved somewhere else. So actually, we're in a really good position with DSI exactly because we have this central repository. I can definitely say anecdotally, although again, no data, is that basic research versus applied research tends to look like this, where at the bottom you have lots of basic research, lots of failed attempts, lots of interesting questions that only generate new knowledge but don't generate products. And then up here at the top, you have your breakthrough, your 1 in a million, and it takes a lot of R&D investment to get there, but it can be out of the park. But you don't want to throw away this middle bottom big fat part of the triangle just to try and get a hold of this. And I think that's what this conversation is trying to get at.
Thank you, Amber. And I am seeing several other very interesting points coming from the participants. We'll touch them in few minutes. But at the same time, yes. So what do you think, Charles, about this benefits, monetary versus non-monetary?
I reiterate what Amber's saying is that we just don't have the data to know what the kinds of benefits are. So we know from 20 years of ABS now that there are not a lot of financial or monetary benefits, but we don't have a good idea about the non-monetary benefits. I've attempted quite a lot to try and track down some of the kind of benefits flowing from ABS agreements. And it's actually really difficult to track down. Once, I've been looking at plant materials, and once plant materials go into national research organizations, governments are really reluctant to then pass on the benefit sharing obligations to generally, poor people, poor farmers, subsistence farmers, to increase the cost or impose a cost on them for the products that I guess have been plant materials that have been bred. So this is a complicated question, and I agree with Amber. We need a lot more data on exactly what are the non-monetary benefits to work out whether we need to actually go back and look at the system. We'll perhaps talk about this a bit later, but we're talking about economic instruments here. We're talking about these access and benefit sharing contracts. These are economic instruments that were in vogue in the late 1980s and the early 1990s. That's 30 years ago now. We know they don't work, so perhaps we actually need to go back and look at exactly what it is we're trying to achieve here, and that this idea of bilateral contracts or these standard contracts may not actually be the best way to, or the most efficient and effective way to resolve these kinds of justice problems. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. I think I understand, and I think both you and Amber agree that we don't have enough data right now, and I think that we need to see that how things move. One thing is, and this is not directly related to this DSI, but I can tell from that experience of this treaty, and many of you are already aware about the SMTA from the Treaty for the Plant Genetic Resources. And one of the idea was that, well, when you share this germplasm, we need to have this signing by SMTA. And one of that component is that any new variety or product or commercial product coming from the use of this germplasm will be shared back to those countries from where this germplasm came. I can tell that based on this, and I would like to be corrected if I'm wrong, but I'm not aware based on my interaction even with the treaty people and other colleagues that how much benefit sharing happened to those countries. Of course, there were a lot of issues for that non-sharing of the germplasm because of all these instruments. And I think as a researcher, we don't want to see the similar kind of thing happening now for the DSI. So this is really very, very important point. Anyway, so I think let's move to that next point, and we will be having some of these discussions. Maybe we can ask, or we can have that feedback from the panel, and they can also read this question if they would like, and I can read this question. And this is related to, again, commercialization of the products from the public data user. So the question is, why can't the commercialization of the products that have used public data be linked to paying for the data at that time? That is, the product cannot be passed through a patent being granted or other similar processes unless there is a payment for the use of public information. So I think this is a really very important point. And the payment then goes into the multilateral fund. If the main worry is that someone will make money off public data, it seems simple enough to create a mechanism that simply charges them for the data once they commercialize the product. So would like to ask my fellow panelists who would like to answer this question. Amber is smiling, so maybe Amber is having this question.
Yeah, no, this is something in the context of a project called Wild DSI that we talked about a lot with different types of experts from legal and scientific perspectives. So there's one political aspect that's very important about this question. The rules around what types of information get disclosed in patent applications falls under the international auspices of WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization. Those are the people that get to decide. And within that, this discussion around disclosing country of origin information, both for genetic resources, also for sequence data, is old, a long-standing conversation. It's complicated, and the political dynamics of that forum are very different than the CBD. And the CBD does not have the ability to fiat and say, dear WIPO, you have to change the rules like that. So it's very difficult for the CBD to stay in its lane if it says the whole benefit sharing mechanism rests upon the WIPO system, right? So there's a little bit of a political, yeah, everybody kind of staying in their own lane issue there, number one. But number two, and far more importantly, from a technical point of view, the issue with saying you used sequence X, therefore you have to pay amount Y downstream, is that it fundamentally requires tracking and tracing. It requires me as the scientist at the very beginning of the value chain to say what I used, when I used it, and if and someday it's commercially developed, that person downstream has to talk about all the sequences that were touched along the way. And then there has to be an attribution mechanism that says, okay, sequence X was 10% of the invention, and sequence Y was 5%, and sequences A through C were 0.1%. And then you get into this bizarre math. And like I said, we're talking about millions of sequences, millions of downloads, millions of users, and thousands of databases. Tracking and tracing all of that and figuring out which thing at which point was responsible for that breakthrough and which percentages makes you want to pull out every single hair on your body. And on top of that, it disincentivizes using those sequences that have conditions. So if you have sequences from Germany or from the United States or from Canada, where there is no access legislation and no conditions on the data, I, as a researcher or as a private entity, am incentivized to avoid the sequences where there are restrictions because it's more complicated. And so then I perversely decrease the value of the things that have the restrictions, which is exactly what we don't want to do when it comes to sustainable use and bioeconomic development. So those are my first reactions. I'm sure my colleagues will have other better ideas, but it's a really good idea in principle and then a really bad idea in practice.
Thank you, Amber, for very good suggestions on this topic. Anyone else would like to answer or to share his or her view? Yogesh, you would like to share something?
No, not at this point.
Okay, good, okay. Yeah, but again, I think this was really very interesting question, and Amber, you have answered very nicely. Now I think that we will have one more question of our panel session, and then after that we will have more questions from that participants. So I think this may, yeah, so if the ABS system generates monetary benefits, how could those be best used to support biodiversity conservation and sustainable use? So I think this is really very important. So in the case if we move like this thing, what we see, how this is going to have that implications on supporting biodiversity conservation. Aiza, I would like to ask you to answer this question. What do you think from your country perspective or from your own research perspective?
Yeah, thank you. So I've been thinking about this for a while, and I was, if we do get monetary benefits, so for example, if they've already, solved the problem of what is the problem and how to actually attribute funds to the use of these resources. I'm thinking of, for example, like what I've said earlier, is to actually do the capacity building in terms of technical capability of the partner countries. So that would be very important, I think. And then in addition, for example, if we're talking about products, coming from microbial cell factories, right, from synthetic biology factories, maybe we can also see it in terms of the companies, private companies actually setting up their shop in the country, so that you also generate employment, perhaps, in the country. So I think those things, but also what was touched upon earlier was, having this multilateral fund to actually have the equitable access to DSI and to research. That would be something I would think about.
Yeah, thank you, Aiza. Thank you. Charles, what would you like to say on this topic?
I think this is an interesting topic, because I think for scientists, there's probably a preferred way of doing this. And most of the conversation among scientists appears to be having some kind of multilateral fund. And I guess the benefit of that is that then means it's a political problem for a different kind of community. It goes into the United Nations, and they have to sort out how they're going to spend the money. So the administration and the performance of the obligations is not at the level of the scientists, it's somewhere else. And so I can see for scientists there's a lot of benefit for that. Essentially, the paperwork administration about how the money is going to be collected and spent, all those sort of things, is done somewhere else. But I think that there's a problem here about exactly what we want the money to do. And I think it's an unresolved problem we have at the CBD. I mean, the CBD is about conservation and sustainable development. And over the 25 years of the CBD, what we've seen is that it's almost exclusively focused on sustainable development. And it's not really focused on biodiversity conservation at all. So I think we probably need to go back and think about what it is we actually want to achieve. Now you've had the discussions here, we've talked about capacity building, those sorts of things, and undoubtedly we've seen from the plant treaty that that's one of the benefits. We see in the PIP framework that the money that they spend there is actually running the global surveillance system, making the information available, those sorts of things. So it's not entirely clear what it is actually that the CBD should be doing. Is it about biodiversity conservation? Is it about sustainable development? What do those sorts of things mean? So if you're going to have the global fund, how are you going to spend the money? That's a political decision in a different forum. And probably a preferable solution for the science community, but I just don't know whether that's actually going to resolve the kind of problem in a way. And it's going to then put the idea of how much money into a different forum, and they're going to then be imposing obligations back on the science community. So it's a complicated one. So I think all I've done again is just add complexity, point out problems, as opposed to provide answers, because I think we're still at this very early stage. And what's great about this network is it's getting people to actually engage and talk about the issues. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Charles. I think, yeah, well said. And yeah, related to similar points, there is another good question from anonymous question, and maybe I would ask Yogesh and Amber to answer that one. That how does the idea of a multilateral system compare to the existing proposals being discussed at the CBD? Because we know that these discussions going on. So what do you think that how this multilateral system is better, or what are the positive things as compared to other proposals? Maybe first Yogesh, then we'll come back to Amber.
I mean, I feel that this multilateral system is a better option because, I mean, it kinds of unifies everything, and based on who has used what information, the contribution is done to a multilateral system, and then looking at the extent of contribution, the benefits can be distributed. Of course, mechanism has to be evolved to find out to what extent and what contribution has been made, but that will, I'm sure, will evolve over the time. So I feel this is a very good suggestion to have the multilateral system.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So Amber, can you please elaborate further that what positive things you see in this multilateral system as compared to the other proposals which are being discussed?
Yeah, I mean, the Nagoya protocol basically sets up a bilateral system, right, between a single user and a single country, and works out how that benefit sharing from that resource or resources will be done. And so I think that in the early discussions of DSI, there was a tendency to say, okay, then it needs to kind of be like Nagoya-ish. But yet in recent, year or maybe more, I think a lot of people that are, well, the scientific community, but also researchers in this field are saying, wait a minute, that really might not fit. And then even, CBD experts, that were here back in the CBD pre-Nagoya days were saying, well, actually, back in the original days of the CBD, it was supposed to be a facilitation mechanism. It didn't have to be bilateral. It worked out that way under Nagoya, but actually going back to the idea of benefit sharing, it doesn't have to be that way. And so the observation that I experience on a daily basis, but I would be interested to hear other colleagues' responses, is that if you set up a bilateral system, be it like a Creative Commons license where some DSI has conditions on it and some doesn't. So you could also do that with blockchain technology and have many different variations of conditions on individual sequences, or you could do it simplified, like with a simple licensing system. You have 4 or 5 licenses that you can pick from and then attach them to the DSI. The problem that I observe with that is that you might not necessarily hinder non-commercial research, so the majority of us here, because let's hope that the value that we contribute in terms of public good is recognized in those licenses, and so we're allowed to use it like we wanted to. The problem that I see is that the private sector is probably more likely than not going to begin to do so-called jurisdiction or forum shopping, where you simply avoid the sequences that have conditions on them because it's simpler, it's easier, and it creates legal certainty. And that's perverse, right? That's the exact opposite of what we want to happen in the context of sustainable use of biodiversity. And so what a multilateral system does, that's super cool, is that it creates the same conditions across the board. It decouples individual sequences from competing with each other and says all sequences are alike. The benefit sharing is not coupled to individual access, to individual tracking and tracing of that sequence along the whole value chain, but rather the benefit sharing happens in a decoupled space and doesn't require or doesn't create this competition or these perverse incentives. And I think That's where I see a sweet spot. And actually, it's cool because you come from the plant space, Rajiv. The reason that the plant treaty ended up, or the International Treaty for Plant Genetic Resources and Food and Agriculture, became multilateral in the first place is for the same reason. The plant genetic resources had already spread across the whole globe, just like DSI has spread everywhere and gone into a central repository. And so the value of those sequences, of those plant genetic resources contributing to value in country was the fundamental reason that I think it ended up going multilateral. I wasn't there, but that's my reading of the history. And so I think that there's a parallel here to the world of DSI.
Thank you, Amber. And I see many interesting questions. And one question, I really like this question. This is more related to capacity building. And I see, Amber, you have answered, but I think that for the benefit of the participants, I will still like to ask this question. And this is that when you were making a presentation, this question came early, but I am asking now, that in your presentation, Amber, you mentioned about the number of countries that are using data from the open access databases. And this person is asking that, well, it will be really good to see and to have a comparison of the frequency of usage of the data per country and the number of research groups able to use the data per country. And how much are lower income countries able to use these data for the public and social uses that is being discussed, perhaps because adequate capacities for such sophisticated usage do not exist in these countries. I think this is really very important. So the question is that perhaps benefit sharing should include efforts to build capacities for more sophisticated use for public and social purposes. So we'll request Amber to answer this question live again here. I know I have seen that you have answered.
Yeah, this is super important. And this is why we put together this diverse network, of people with very different perspectives and researching in very different countries. This is true. I mean, the world's not fair. The playing field is not level, no question about it. As I showed you in the bar graph, scientists in low and middle income countries relative to their OECD peers produce 40% fewer publications based on DSI. So no question there's a gap there. The amazing thing about DSI and the central database is, in my opinion, it's a leapfrog opportunity. So policy wonks, policy experts use the idea of leapfrogging to talk about a technology that has the ability to skip over certain phases of development. So the classic example is the limiting infrastructure in low-income countries where internet was not widely available because broadband, the fiber optic cables weren't available. And what happened is leapfrog technology, such as the cell phones that we all carry around today, made the internet available to the vast majority of low and middle income countries in the absence of infrastructure, in the absence of fiber optic cables. So here, I think we see the exact same thing. We see the ability of synthetic biology and of the sequence databases to leapfrog over the need to have $1 million sequencing infrastructure in your basement and a terabyte server in your basement. What you can do is through the use of cloud technologies, through the use of the databases, you can leapfrog and use things. And that's what Eiza was saying, I think, when she was talking about the need to be able to have the access to the databases to compare her marine organisms to things that have already been sequenced before and not having to resequence everything herself. It is that and more. But getting that capacity building means that the sequences we need to have more of them. We need to fund more sequencing of sequences from those countries. And we need to have more research and training and more international collaboration. But we don't get that by locking up the sequences behind a paywall.
Yeah. Thank you, Amber. I think this is, as you said, I also believe that we really need to work in this direction. This is very important. We need to make the playground the same level. So anyway, so moving on, one more thing which I recognize by seeing these different questions, and that there have been many questions about the role of the private sector, and there seemed to be an issue of the trust or concerns regarding their use of the DSI. So question is, could a multilateral system help addressing this? For example, someone suggested they could contribute matching fund to support the databases. I think, Eiza, I may like to ask this question to you, especially your country, Philippines. They expressed a lot of concern about the biopiracy, etc. So would you like to share your view on this particular point?
Yeah, I could see that work for us, because if I see the problem by attributing how much % of the work was obtained by a particular sequence, and that might be actually counter to the way we do research and progress. So it's going to be, it will disincentivize other people to do it. But for example, if we have this multilateral fund, if this is an option, then I would think of it as a good way to put this monetary benefit, because it will, number one, capacitate the local researchers. It's another avenue for them to get funding for basic research. The other thing that I want to also point out is, like what Amber said, the timeline between basic research and then coming up with a commercial product, it's really, really very long, and the paths are different, in terms of, a product. So I'm not quite sure if, paying, this is my personal opinion, I'm not quite sure if paying upfront for the use of the databases would actually be, actually incentivizing or against it. So yeah, I'm hearing of some of these suggestions for the first time. So that's very good. But I think that's what I want to contribute for now, Rajiv.
Thank you very much, Eiza. So I think, let me see some other question if we have, and we got few more minutes, but maybe let me see. But before that, I can also request to all our panelists to be ready with some of their final words, because I would like to give 1 or 2 minutes to each of them, that because we are now coming close to the session. So would like to request each of you to share your final words in this session, in the case if we don't have many questions. And although there are several questions, but I think in the interest of time, we will not be able to take up many questions, but several questions were answered by our panelists, and some of them, they were answered live. So yeah, anyway, so okay, good. Let's go ahead. So maybe that, okay, there is one more question. Maybe I would like to see. No, yeah, well, so I think we already have seen all the questions. Yeah, so this was about the country perspective. But again, although I know that Amber has touched this point about this capacity building, so that these other countries should also be able to use, to make the best use of the DSI. In the case some of our other panelists would like to highlight this point, or would like to summarize their views after this session, I would really appreciate. I don't have any order to ask, but maybe in my screen I see Yogesh first. I can ask Yogesh first, then Charles.
Okay, thanks. So, I mean, it's a very complex question as to how do you ensure the benefit sharings from DSI, because as Amber had pointed it out, that there are thousands of sequences, there are millions of sequences, and commercial product may develop which makes use of few thousand sequences out of that. So how do you assign a value to a specific sequence is a very, very complex question. But at the same time, there is a concern on from mega biodiversity hotspots or biodiversity rich countries, like they had for organisms, that the information generated by them should not be exploited by other countries for their own benefits. So it needs a lot of discussion with all the concerned stakeholders to satisfy their concern and evolve a solution which is acceptable to all of them. And it requires a lot of discussion, lot of education also, and evolve a solution. I mean, it's a must. Otherwise, again, I fear that it would, I could see actually that it could end with the same problem that we have with organisms and microbial cultures right now. So it involves discussion and education.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Yogesh. Very nicely put. Thank you very much. Charles?
Well, thank you, Rajiv. I guess I mean I don't want to be too pessimistic, but I think that ABS has a problem, and I think that we've had as I say 30 years of it, and it hasn't almost 30 years, and it hasn't worked very well. So we need to actually think about what it is we're trying to achieve with our access and benefit sharing. So clearly there is a justice problem here. There's clearly a problem about technology transfer and finances to poorer countries. And so we need to work on the way to resolve that. But, really, I guess, echoing what Yogesh is saying is that we need to make sure that we don't actually harm the scientific community when we're trying to harm or trying to generate some kind of solution. So there is a real problem. We need to find a solution to it, but we need to be cautious that we don't actually do a lot of harm on the way there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these words. Now, Mutsuaki, what you would like to say in summary from this session, please?
Yeah, thank you. We want to share the benefit of the biotechnology with people all over the world, namely the environmental protection, sustainable use, and human and animal welfare, and improvement of life. The ABS of genetic resources is very important, I know. Let's work together in the science base and also economical research base and evidence base to discuss how to implement the Nagoya protocol and how to solve the issue of the DSI. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mutsuaki. Aija?
Yeah, I think I echo what Yogesh said about education, educating the stakeholders. But for me, I think it also needs to be a conversation within countries. So for example, in my country, what do we really want to get out of it, and what is actually doable, and what is practical, and what is actually would not impede the progress of basic research. So I agree also with Charles that we still have a long ways to go in terms of discussions in this regard. But we've started the conversation. That's important.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. So Amber, now we would like to hear from you.
Well, after so many smart things have already been said, I don't know that there's anything left. I do see that there was kind of one remaining question in the Q&A, so I can add that into my closing comments. I think from Abba Zashina, this idea of yeah, again, trying to level the playing field and a lack of sophisticated capacity development. I think we've touched on this a number of times, but this is, again, the fundamental driving desire of this network that's hosting today. To say, look, the playing field's not level, but what we don't think will move the needle is to create perverse incentives by perpetuating the bilateral system that, again, as the commenter points out, does not really seem to be working or generating benefits. To just repeat that and say, oh, I hope that in a high-tech, big data field, that same system will work again. Yeah, I think that's exactly what each of us are saying is, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And that certainly seems like what the DSI system is. And if it is broken, then fix it, And what Eiza said, her last comment, this idea of starting the dialogue. I think that each of us in the scientific community has the ability not only to talk with scientists around the world, because we do that in our work anyway, but now is really a critical time for us to go back to our national policymakers. And that's a secondary mission of the network, is really to offer national briefings and to enable regional policymakers to connect with their regional scientists. We don't yet at this early stage of the network have one scientist from every country in the world, but we're really interested in offering our collective experiences to talk about the basics, to talk about anything from the basics up to the most current discussions on benefit sharing. And so I guess that would be where I would close, Rajiv, is to say exactly where Charles started off. We need to create more dialogue. And if you're sitting out there today as a policymaker and you want to talk to scientists that use DSI, we're here, knock on our door, and we'd love to talk to you, and we'd love to continue this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Amber. And okay, so now, in any other point, if somebody would like to share before I close? we don't see any hand now. So maybe I would like to share some of my views or also that closing this session. So I think we had very productive session and we had very good discussion on this very important topic. I saw that we had really have a good number of participants. They continued from the start of that event till now. So we really appreciate their interest and their cooperation and participating in this session. So thank you very much. I think we heard various views from our panelists, how they're using DSI in their research, how should it happen, and we had really good discussions on benefit sharing mechanism for DSI from the perspective of all of our panelists, and there were many good points came out from the participants on the different areas. In my view, and this is already happening, but that's the point that we are discussing, that what kind of proposals are being discussed. But at present, for instance, DSI and its free accessibility are essential for all areas of the life sciences, including biodiversity research, development of new varieties for food security, or diagnostics, vaccine development for human health, etc. And current model for DSI is open access, which in my opinion, as I said, enables scientific reproducibility, enforces scientific integrity, also enables globally non-monetary benefit sharing, including scientific capacity building. And this point also came in our discussion. In developing countries, precisely because everything is open, free, and reusable. Several times, I know from even India, many of us are having this assumption that we are bigger provider, but then from the presentation from Amber, we could see very clearly that, well, we are also one of those biggest user as well. So we need to see from all these perspectives. And if we will go for a benefit sharing based solely on the country of origin of the DSI, as many of us know, then this will benefit only few countries. While low and middle income countries do not contribute the majority of the DSI, their scientists access this information with the same access opportunities as researchers from other countries do. But yes, there was a discussion about the capacity building, and this is very much required. So I think, as our panelists highlighted, and this was the basically topic of this webinar, we believe that this multilateral system for the ABS for DSI is really very, very useful, will be helpful for especially low and middle income countries. There were discussion about this private sector, public sector. I think we need to address this issue. We need to protect, or we need to pay attention about the biopiracy, etc. We need to work more that how we can have this multilateral fund and they can be used for the capacity building. And policymakers in various countries need to know these things, especially from the middle and low income countries, that based on the data sets, what is telling, not just based on our assumption or our gut feeling that this is going to happen or like that. And once we understand it much more better manner, then we can address those challenges and we can really contribute nicely for the options for the DSI and access benefit sharing. Amber highlighted again and again, and not only Amber, but other places as well. Let's bring scientists in those discussions, have their feedback. Dialogue is very important. And I think this event is one of those, is in the series of those dialogue. So in my opinion, these kind of webinars and discussions, they create awareness and will help scientists as well as policymakers in appreciating the role of DSI and access benefit sharing to take appropriate and I will say informed decisions in their countries. Some of us who are the panelists and also that participants, they are already participating in many discussions in their country. So I think that we can really contribute nicely, and then these countries' government can make some informed decisions. And I know that DSI Scientific Network is organizing similar sessions in other continents. I think they started from Asia. They will be going to Sub-Saharan Africa and South America. So I think these kind of things, they're really required and they will really help scientific community, policymakers globally. So these are some of my perspective. And I think as Isabel mentioned, Amber mentioned that if our participants would like to know more, they may please contact DSI Scientific Network. I think Isabel is maybe putting some slides she mentioned to me. So Isabel, you can put that slide so that people can get that information. And
sorry.
finally,
oh, go
you are
ahead.
showing, sorry.
No,
Okay.
go ahead, Rajiv.
Okay. Yeah, so I think that's what I wanted to say, and would not like to repeat what our panelists said, but I'm very much happy and very pleased to have this session. And I'm sure that like me, our panelists and our participants may be benefited from this panel discussion. Finally, I would like to request you all to join me in thanking all panelists for their insightful discussions, sharing their experience and vision. And of course, sincere thanks to all the audience for their participation and interaction. Without them, we wouldn't have this lively session. Finally, I would like to thank DSI Scientific Network, and especially Isabel Coxey and her team to organize this session and for giving me the opportunity to moderate the session. So thank you very much. And with these words, thanks one and all. And I would like to close the session, and I wish you a great day ahead and enjoy the day. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you. Ciao.